see and exactly how women might fit into the puzzle. So, well, like most of you, I'm here with more questions than knowledge. I have lots of questions on my mind and a very tiny bit of information that I already know about climate change and so forth. What we do know is that it's everybody's problem and that it doesn't fall into the category of a typical women's issue. But what we're starting to realize, the more and more, is that it is actually a women's issue, and it's an issue that where the solution, I think, lies in our hands, in the hands of women. So let me tell you a tiny little bit about the Global Women's Caucus and why some of us thought that it was time that we turn our attention to global warming. Okay, yeah. So, our Global Women's Caucus is now over 5,000 members strong in over 100 countries. We have women, active women all over, so it's very exciting to know that. We've organized several action teams which focus on various issues, as Connie mentioned earlier. We do research on these topics and we educate our members. We develop activist toolkits so that people in small living rooms all over the world can study these issues. We create online events and all kinds of other interesting things. Our existing teams right now are the ERA, Reproductive Justice, Communications, Candidate Information, and Books Abroad, which is a feminist reading group. So, and with this, hello? With this evening's event, we're launching our newest GWC action team, Women and Climate. So why does the Women's Caucus need to have a climate team, actually? Well, now I'd like to share with you a recent personal experience that I had that really opened my eyes to the fact that the mother of all women's issues today, I think, really is climate change. Well, I attended a conference where I represented our GWC. And there were women from all over the world there who were there to discuss those 12 critical areas of concern that were flagged in 1995 at the Beijing Women's Conference, the same one where Hillary made the news. Yeah. So each issue was like a different piece of a giant women's empowerment puzzle, you could say. And climate was originally just one of those puzzle pieces. But what was really interesting, I observed this firsthand as I went from one group to the next group to little breakout sessions, is that that word, climate, was seeping into every conversation about every other one of those 12 areas of concern, whether it was poverty or economics or safety, all of these other issues, reproductive justice, they were all talking climate. Everybody was talking climate. So I thought that was really, that made a huge impression on me, actually. So then at the end of the conference, at the wrap up at the end of this thing, is what really shocked me in it. And something happened there that I think should give all Americans living overseas a real jolt. As the microphone was passed around, as it always happens, and each of the participants were asked to share their hopes and concerns, the attention kept focusing on me, of all people. I happened to be the only American in the hall. And one after another, these participants, these women from all over the world, turned to me and said, they voiced their fears about our government, about the Republicans, about Trump, of course, all about U.S. politics. They were all concerned with my tiny little piece of this giant puzzle, and I was pretty shocked by that. The gist was sort of like this. If you're not successful in this election, you're making things much more difficult for all of us. If you lose, we all lose. So, my two takeaways from that conference were these. One, that our success or failure in this election impacts way more than just women in America. It affects everybody. And 2, every other aspect of women's empowerment is impacted by climate change, whether it's reproductive rights, equality, security, really everything. And that's why the formation of this GWC action team is so very important to me. And that's why I'm so anxious to hear from our experts, from our guests, and really start digging into this. So, because I don't know that much about it. I know that it's crucial, and I know that I have a lot to learn. So now I'd like to introduce our guests. Our first speaker will be Alyssa Fisher. Alyssa is a climate and sustainability expert with a focus on urban climate challenges and the inclusion of equity into climate conversations. And she's going to give us an overview on urban policies and talk about how perceptions of climate change differ between men and women. Then we'll hear from Dr. Cara Maizano. Cara is a scientist and researcher in environmental epidemiology and exposure science at INSERM at the Sorbonne University, focusing on how the physical environment affects public health. She's part of C40's Women for Climate mentorship program, and she will provide an overview of health impacts of climate change. And finally, we'll hear from Dana Powers. Dana is an environment journalist specializing in renewable energy. She chairs the Democrats Abroad France Environment Policy Group. And she'll help us understand the nexus between gender, population, and climate change. So now I'll sit down and let the experts speak, and let's all listen. Okay.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you all today. Oh, no. Okay, am I good? Okay. It's a pleasure to be talking to you all today about something that I care very much about, and I'm glad to see is becoming a part of the bigger, wider conversation. So why do we talk about women and gender and climate, and how are these topics connected? It's a bit of a stretch, I think, for many people to see those intersections, but they're real, and there are so many different ways in which they are connected. So today, I've come to understand that this is a bit of a diverse audience. Everyone has different specialties, different topics of interest. So I wanted to take a broader look at this issue, and rather than diving deep into any one, rather than diving deep into any one particular topic, I wanted to kind of highlight the different facets of the conversation and give you tastes of what people are talking about, and so you can do more. I'm happy to help you point out more resources if you'd like to know more about any one of these different concepts. So there's so much work to be done. So hopefully everyone will find something that they find interesting within this conversation, and you can take something home. So studies show that globally, women are significantly more impacted by climate change than men are. In fact, 80% of people displaced by climate change are women, and 80%. It's a huge, huge number, and it's due to a number of different factors depending on the location and the type of disaster that people are experiencing. But it's often due to the fact that women are much less likely to have socioeconomic power and independence. They're more likely to experience poverty, and they're less likely to own assets like land, a home, livestock, credit, or the savings that are needed to invest in rebuilding your life. For example, before Hurricane Katrina, more than half of poor families in New Orleans were headed by single mothers. 83% of those low-income single mothers never moved back to their homes after the storm. That's almost the entire demographic block. Another example, after a tsunami in 2004 that affected Sri Lanka, India, and Indonesia, surviving men outnumbered surviving women by 3-1. In cases like this, women are less likely to survive because they are more often at home. They lose essential time looking for and taking care of their family members. They're less likely to know how to swim, and in this particular case, they're likely to be wearing clothes that restrict their movement, like long skirts and scarves. As these types of storms and disasters become more frequent and become more severe in the face of climate change, these losses of our sisters will multiply. Loss of life is also a risk, an increasing risk from increasingly poor air quality, and Kara's going to talk a bit more about that. That is her area of specialty. But I wanted to add 2 important facts about this issue while we're on the topic. First, air quality is considered to be a leading threat to pregnant women and their unborn children, and to in utero development, however you want to talk about that. I know that's a loaded phrase. But second, nearly all of the 50 largest cities in the world do not meet the World Health Organization's air quality standards. With more than 50% of the world's population living in cities since 2009, and that number is expected to grow to 2/3 of the world population living in cities by 2050. That's an enormous amount of people. A majority of the world's people do not have clean air to breathe. And so when we talk about climate solutions in cities, we often talk a lot about public transport. And as someone who's spent a good deal of her career in that field, I can tell you that women are severely underrepresented when it comes to developing strategies, making plans, designing systems, and then implementing them. And it shows in the way that our cities are planned, and it matters for women's health and safety the world over. Studies show that women use transportation differently than men do. We move in different ways and we have different priorities in our days, but transportation systems are almost always designed with men's needs in mind. And similarly, women are more likely to live in poverty. They actually make up 80% of the world's poor, and to work in the informal sectors. Both of these factors, plus the insufficiency of most public transportation systems, means that women are often pedestrians and cyclists, and those are the most vulnerable road users. In fact, 1.3 million people die globally every year in traffic accidents, and 50% of those people are pedestrians. In 2015, road fatalities were the leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 29, and the second leading cause of death for people aged 5 to 59 after heart disease. That's more than people who died from cancer, from diarrheal diseases, from HIV/AIDS, but we don't talk about it. We don't like to acknowledge that fact because we all are so dependent on cars, and despite the fact that it's the equivalent of 8 Boeing 747s crashing every single day. So as more people move into cities, especially vulnerable migrants who are fleeing climate change, it's essential that city leaders take on this issue. And these kinds of conversations do happen more often when women are in leadership positions. A global survey of women in leadership found that women in government are more likely to support and to commit to international efforts to curb climate change than their male counterparts. And that's all well and good, but only 5% of mayors around the world are women. And only 10% of the world's nearly 200 capital cities are headed by women. So how do we get women into these kinds of leadership positions? By empowering them and by educating them. In fact, in an empirical modeling study comparing 100 solutions to fight climate change, educating women and girls and securing reproductive rights were found to be the 7 emissions avoided. Combined, they are in fact the #1 climate strategy. Now this is not a challenge. These challenges are not isolated to developing countries. In the US, 45% of pregnancies are unintended. But I'm not going to talk too much about that because I know Dana's got a lot to say on population. No, she doesn't. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Women in rural areas, though, are also at greater risk of climate impacts than their male counterparts. For example, in Ghana, drought has led to pressure for many young women to leave home and find work in cities, where they are forced into more dangerous, more precarious jobs than their male counterparts, who often find work in construction and other more standardized manual labor industries. The women who do stay home when men go to find work in cities often need to take charge not only of their household and become the sole caregivers, but are also responsible for the farms and other industries and money-making mechanisms that the men leave behind. And studies show that when women are more economically empowered, they invest in their households more than men do. They're more likely to pay for childcare, and especially for daughters to go to school. They're more likely to make investments that will pay off in the long term for their entire household. And they're more likely to save money, whereas men are more likely to spend money on themselves first, buying alcohol, cigarettes, TVs, and other luxury items. Climate change also impacts rural households by changing weather patterns in ways that impact women more severely. Typically in agricultural communities, women and men plant different crops. Men plant cash crops, whereas women plant subsistence crops. Men's plots are prioritized, so investments in fertilizers and other technologies are made for men's plots, and women don't really get those investments made. And that leaves women's plots more susceptible to failure in cases of climate disaster. Similarly, that priority leads to that technology being used more often on men's plots, meaning that women's plots are planted later in the seasons and are harvested less efficiently. And later planting and harvesting times, again, makes them more susceptible to climate disasters like dry spells or droughts. Droughts also mean that women who are responsible for water collection have to walk further and have to spend more time and effort carrying more water back to their homes. Relatedly, women make up almost half of agricultural workers worldwide, but they're significantly less likely to have access to land rights, credit, education, or the technology that can help them create long-term productive plots and sustainable, efficient farms. It's been shown that if all women smallholders received equal access to productive resources like education, technology, and such, their farm yields would rise by 20 to 30%, and that could feed an additional 100 to 150 million people worldwide. More productive plots also reduce the need for deforestation, which avoids the associated carbon emissions with that. The relationship between gender and climate is extremely complex, and it's very wide-reaching, as I hope that has been shown. But women are both a vulnerable group and underutilized agents of change. There are a number of different ways we can take action, though. Organizations like WeDo is leading research and advocacy on these world issues around the world, fighting for women and the environment at the same time. By voting for women and fundraising for women's candidates and supporting educational opportunities for girls, we get more women in positions of power. And in fact, studies have shown that American women are more likely to understand the risks associated with climate change and more likely to support policies and pass policies to combat it than men are. According to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications, a greater proportion of American women than men understand and will say that climate change is currently harming the U.S., that they support mitigation policies, and that they worry about the risks of climate change on their communities, wildlife, and future generations. Governments and international bodies around the world are waking up to these connections, but they're not doing it quickly enough or putting enough money behind those connections. And it's our job to put our time and our effort and our money behind getting women into leadership positions, supporting women who are fleeing climate disasters, and helping to improve opportunities for women who want to become leaders of change.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? So I wanted to say thank you to Sheila for hosting this and to Connie and Anne for everything you did to organize. Thanks, Alyssa, for that great introduction. I'm really glad to be here. And I'm here to talk about climate change and health impacts. I'm going to do a quick overview of the health impacts of climate change, and then I'll talk about women specifically. So I know people don't normally think about health when they think about climate change. They might think about oil and gas or polar bears, sea level rise. But there is a long list of health impacts that we need to, be aware of and that need to be addressed. So I'm going to start off by saying that climate change is probably the biggest threat to public health that humanity has ever seen. And I say that because it's truly global. It affects all of us. It affects all ages. It affects all demographics. It affects men and women differently, but it affects everybody. And almost nobody is going to get to escape that. Broadly speaking, there are two ways that this happens. One, climate change may exacerbate health impacts that already happen due to climate. I mean, our health has been affected by climate forever. That's nothing new, but climate change will increase the frequency and severity of those types of events. But it will also bring about unprecedented impacts that we haven't seen before, or possibly effects that maybe weren't seen in one part of the globe, but are now being seen there. And I'll explain a little bit. So I said there's a long list, so I'm just going to actually list all these things without giving you too much information on the mechanisms behind this, but we can, if anybody has questions, you can ask me later. So what are some of the ways that climate impacts health? Heat waves and cold snaps. So we're aware during the summer, especially in Paris, that people die when it gets really hot, especially the elderly and possibly young kids. Wildfires is another big topic right now. We see see how much Australia is affected. California was affected. I had friends that were from Paradise. I don't know what, I mean, the cities. So wildfires. But wildfires, it's not just that things are gone, it's that there's so much smoke in the air that you can't breathe. Floods, droughts. Vector-borne diseases are a big issue because the range in which the vectors, the mosquitoes, for example, can live will increase. So as northern latitudes become warmer, mosquitoes can migrate and live further north. So what might typically be seen as a disease in the global south will start moving north. We see that with dengue fever, Zika, for example, but it happens also in the US. So Lyme disease is a big issue in the Northeast, and it's getting worse because of climate change. In fact, that's one of the first articles I saw on climate and health, because I've been talking about this for a while, and it's just recently that the news is starting to catch up. But one of the first articles I saw in a mainstream paper was on Lyme disease, and how it's increasing in frequency in the Northeast U.S. Air quality issues. So air pollution is a big problem globally. I think especially in Paris it comes up quite a bit, but it comes up probably far more frequently in other countries that have worse air pollution than we do. But it's a problem everywhere. Asthma and allergies. So allergies can get worse. So as there's more carbon dioxide in the air, we get more plants actually, and you get more pollen. So that sounds great, but people who suffer from allergies will or could suffer more. Water security issues and other water issues, such as like increased salinity in groundwater as sea levels rise. That's one issue. Nutrition and food security. So this is not that well known, but levels of carbon dioxide affect the nutrient content in your vegetables and your food. So as CO2 levels go up, the nutrient content can go down. I don't understand the science behind it exactly, but it's an issue in general. Access to healthcare is an issue, especially in the wake of natural disasters. Mental health issues, and that's starting to become more and more discussed in news. And not just anxiety about climate change, which is obviously a problem, but people who have been displaced or people who are suffering are at risk of a whole range of mental health issues. Algal blooms are a problem. There are a lot of problems, and Alyssa alluded to some of the negative effects on prenatal health that climate change can bring. So heat for one, air quality is another, salinity in the water because of sea level rise. Increased healthcare costs, and here I'm going to give an example because I read it, I was kind of shocked. Due to 10 extreme events in 2002, which were wildfires, a hurricane, and a West Nile virus outbreak, there were 900 dead, 40,000 hospitalized, but the whole thing cost $1.6 billion. So just due to these 10 events in 2012. Finally, one of the biggest issues I think that, because it's going to span all of the others, is migration and forced migration. So we don't really think about migration as a health issue, but imagine if you were forced to migrate, or imagine what the people who have been forced to migrate from Syria have been dealing with, and I don't think that they've been able to prioritize their health at all. Since tonight's event is focused on women, I'll talk about how some of these things affect women specifically. So a lot of these risks disproportionately affect marginalized groups. So the super low income, people who are disabled. And since there are, I think Alyssa gave some numbers, the number I have here is that globally 1.3 billion people in low and middle income countries live below the poverty line, and 70% of those are women. So they're all at risk of suffering worse than others. So just to give some more specific examples, respiratory and cardiac disease impacts women more than others, from low air quality, I should say. So the impacts from low air quality can impact women more than men because we have different sized lungs, basically. So the amount of particles that get lodged in there are higher. Poor air quality is associated with negative birth outcomes. One example, and this is something that I've worked on, is that a lot of times, everybody sort of is exposed more or less, at least in Paris, to the same thing, but in the global south, there are a lot of people doing a lot of cooking on wood burning or coal burning stoves in the house, and the pollution from those is so much higher than pollution from traffic. And in a study that I'm working on now, we see that pollution from these cook stoves is about 4 or 5 times the pollution coming from traffic from a bunch of diesel vehicles or burning of waste at a landfill is 4 times higher, like on average. And there's women there that are, having to tend to the food, but they've also got little children with them, because the pictures they sent, there's like all these little kids inside, that are staying with their mother. So and I say that as a women's issue. It's also a children's issue because those kids weren't all female. But so food insecurity, women have higher rates of anemia, so they also have different nutritional needs. They have increased nutritional needs during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So when food security is threatened, they may be at risk of exacerbating or suffering in that way, exacerbating the problems. Another thing that Alyssa mentioned is that the majority of smallholder farms are owned by women, and their livelihoods are at risk due to climate events. And also, I think, just like you said, during climate disasters, hurricanes, floods, and other disasters, women suffer a disproportionate amount of mortality. And one of the stories I heard was not just the things that you said, and I was kind of shocked I didn't even think about the clothing issue, was that women sometimes are waiting at home for their husbands before fleeing, and then they get caught. And I think there was an event where I think 80% of the mortalities were women, partly because these women were staying at home waiting for someone to come. Also, and I was surprised to learn this, that survivors can, and there's a reference somewhere, have been seen to have a decreased life expectancy. They're also at a higher risk of physical and sexual and domestic violence after some of these events due to the stress that's going on. They're at a higher risk of mood disorders, and they have a poor economic recovery. In terms of migration, a lot of times women are at a higher risk of being trafficked because of some of these things. And then, the list goes on. So vector diseases, pregnant women actually attract more mosquitoes because you produce more CO2, and mosquitoes are attracted to the CO2. That's actually how they know you're there. And then also pregnant women are more vulnerable to some of these diseases anyways. Water scarcity has a whole set of issues, and I'm not going to go into them, but water issues during pregnancy, or we all know, I guess we don't all know, that that during pregnancy you need a lot more liquids, but also it can force women to have to travel long distances to get water in the first place. So, and I think we're, globally we're trying to eliminate this problem by installing wells and stuff, and climate change could make this worse. So this is just a sample of some of the things that we'll all have to deal with, but women specifically, just to give you a flavor. I feel like I just listed a bunch of doomsday scenarios. So I'll give the mic to Dana. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's an old American Indian saying that women hold up half the sky. It's a beautiful saying, I think. But right now, the sky, the atmosphere, has well more than 400 parts per million of CO2, and this is a grave problem. When Connie first proposed that I come and speak to this group, I had no interest in doing it, frankly. My interest has been largely focused on finding solutions to the climate crisis and not on focusing on impacts. I've been more interested in mitigation of climate problems than in adapting or responding to the impacts. But nonetheless, I think there are basically three broad areas that we can understand the issue of women and climate change. And they've clearly been mentioned by the previous speakers. The first one is women as victims of climate change. Women as receiving those impacts. And I think Kara and Alyssa very, very poignantly and very specifically pointed that out, okay? So I'm not going to go into that a lot. But I will say in general that sociologists talk about people having life chances based on how much resources they have. Are they rich? Are they poor? Are they middle? Do they have connections in their communities? Are they supported? Do they have resources? Do they have health, etc.? And any time a group is less entitled or has less resources, it will be impacted more than a group that is more entitled and has more resources. Okay? So this is true of women. Just to say that broadly, life chances also has the flip side, death chances. The poor, women, etc., are more likely to die in any given set of constraints than men. That's just the way it is. I mean, all those factors can add up. The second perspective that we can begin to understand these two very complex issues of climate change and gender is to look at women's role, traditional role in I'm getting distracted here, in a very strong development process, and that is the demographic transition, which has historically occurred in the last couple of hundred years in developed countries, and much more recently in the last 20 years in some of the emerging economies, and is not yet finished in much of Africa. What is the demographic transition? The demographic transition is when you have an underdeveloped, quote unquote, society, you have a very high death rate and you have a very high birth rate. And then as we modernize and science comes in and health and better agriculture and everything kick in, the death rate begins to go down, but the birth rate is still high, okay? And so suddenly you have a big difference and a big bulge of population occurs, and finally the birth rate begins to go down, and in the developed countries you tend to have low death rates and low birth rates, okay? So we've noticed that population is a very important factor in climate change. Why is that? Because each of us are consuming, producing, doing stuff, and it all adds up to a lot more CO2 and methane and the rest of it. So with a lot more people, we use a lot more resources, we make a lot more pollution, and right now, I mean, there was one study I recently heard that in terms of the weight of mammals on the planet, something like slightly under 30% of the weight of mammals is humanity. And just somewhat under 70% are the domestic animals we use to eat. And then 7% are the wildlife, the wild animals, okay? That's what's left. Now, I'm not talking about insects, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But, well, they're not fish, but you know what I mean. So, anyway, population is one of these very, very important nexuses. We're now predicting that with all these demographic transitions that are finally kicking in, that the world's population is supposed to stabilize. It's supposed to stabilize somewhere mid-century about at perhaps 9.5 to 10 billion. And perhaps by the end of the century, it could be 10 to 12 billion. We're at 7.6 or 7 now, something like that. That's a lot of people, and we're using a lot of resources. We're overfishing. The oceans are already acidified and full of plastic, but in addition, you know, a lot of people are predicting there'll be no fish by 2048. Ecosystems are collapsing a lot, and the weight of humanity is just too strong. Now, this can be alleviated by finding better ways of doing things that impact the earth much less. You know, if I drive an electric car and my solar panels have charged my electric car, I'm making less of an impact than someone who's driving an internal combustion engine car, gas or diesel, and, you know, sending out fumes, okay? We won't go into all the niceties, but basically, if we can recycle well, if we can use our resources efficiently, if we can get longer life items that aren't produced for obstruction but for long life, all these things mean the Earth's carrying capacity can be more, okay? But in the meantime, women and our reproductive role has been a really important issue for the climate, okay? So what happened, just to list a few of the items, because sometimes it seems so illogical when we see countries that are very overcrowded having lots of babies, and we think, what's that all about? And in underdeveloped countries, children are an investment good. You have a lot of children to help you do your farming and work, and as you become a developed country, those children need to be schooled, and you end up spending a lot on your children, and so they become more of a consumer good. And so that kind of difference in attitude is what's been happening now in a lot of the emerging economies, as suddenly their rates of fertility have gone way down, okay? And the other thing about that is that in countries where all you have is your family, you want children because they're going to take care of you when you're old. And you're particularly in patrilocal societies, you want a son because it's your daughter-in-law who's going to take care of you when you're old. Okay? Think of the one-child policy in China and all the missing women. Is it that? I remember Amartya Sen wrote an incredible article in the New York Times 30 years ago. 100 million women were missing. 300 now. Now, 300 now. So what happens, you have a lot of extra men because of the infanticide and abortions that the parents did, thinking they were better off having a male child. But there aren't any wives for them now. What are they good for? Oh, cannon fodder. So, no, I'm being very cynical there. Clearly not. But that hasn't actually helped the women in these situations because, in fact, one would think in those situations with fewer women, their value and status would increase. Not necessarily. Sometimes they just go and steal women from other villages. But anyway, that's another thing. In China also, in one area where people made a cultural change and decided that women could take care of their aging parents, suddenly girl babies were just as desirable as boy babies. So all these cultural factors have to change, and we have to raise awareness all over the world so that, you know, the idea of having a small family, which makes sense for the planet, becomes also a sensible choice for each individual family. And that's happening because part of these jobs that were once on the back of the family alone now are taken care of by the state, for example, the collectivity, when you have social security, okay, and other ways of supporting older people and, old people's homes and so forth, the weight is not all falling on the children. So many factors kick in here as a society develops. But empowerment of women is also part of that. Because as women are empowered and have more control over their reproductive choices, then they can decide what makes sense. We all decide these things in context. We don't decide them in isolation. What's the ideal number of having children? We decide these in the context. As I said, I think in France you could fit 3 kids in the back seat. After that, God knows what you're going to do with the 4th. But I'm being silly there, of course. But we all decide things in context. So the choice to have how many children is not just a choice of how many people exist in the world and are waiting upon it. It's what I and my family and my vision for the future of my family, what makes sense. And as the countries develop, we want smaller families. As women are empowered, they generally choose smaller families. But to do that also, we need availability of birth control. Planned Parenthood, for example, has been very active all over the world, and other organizations. But if the Republicans continue to push for defunding Planned Parenthood and having things like the global gag rule, where NGOs abroad don't get funding if they talk about family planning or abortion or anything like that, then we're not really helping these countries with these very crucial health issues. Okay, so let me see what I'm missing, because I always go beyond myself. Right. Oh yeah, just to mention another thing. This past year in 2019, the Earth Overshoot Day was July 19th. Each year, the day in which we surpass the renewable resources gets earlier and earlier. We need a few planets, well, 2 points, I don't know what the number is, but we need a few planets to give us the resources that we need. And some wacko people think we should go colonize Mars. I think we should take care of the planet we've got. So there are all these factors making, the planet is in dire shape, really dire shape. And all the impacts that we can think of for women are occurring for the whole population of humanity. The day that the sea rise really happens quickly, and so much land area will be covered with salt water. So many cities. Miami at a super high tide is flooded now every time. York, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, lots of island communities are already getting flooded. We don't have, these people are going to have to move to higher ground. And what's that going to do to the real estate markets and poverty and so forth? And arable land. So there's so many factors that are coming into play. But, okay, I've talked about 2 things a little bit here. I've touched on women as victims of climate change, and of course that was beautifully laid out beforehand. Secondly, women as actors in the traditional role of the reproducers of the next generation. And thirdly, I think it's important to talk about women as agents of change, as empowered women. We have all, I don't know about the younger women here so much as us in the older categories, we have all been oppressed as women. We've all been told that we're not as bright as men. Not that clearly, but it's the message got across, right? And somehow that we were not as welcome in many places in the world to do various tasks as men were welcome to go. I remember when I was an undergraduate in the early 70s, I was the only female economics student in my department, except for 2 old ladies who came to take courses. But I was the only young one. And I've spent my life, I feel, going into places where there's hardly any women. Now it's energy conferences. And I think that women carry a perspective that is very, very important for the world. Having been through economics, believe me, I've been totally immersed in the economistic view of the world, and I have rejected and rebelled against it. I feel the study of economy should be how you distribute resources equally and fairly and well among people so that all human beings are well taken care of. Women have carried the weight of most caring, family caring, on their shoulders. And because of that, I think women put people before the economy. And this is what we need, this perspective, to care about people more than some business plan of somebody, okay? We need that. The climate, taking care of the climate, is much more important than any fossil fuel company making a profit. So it's important for women's perspectives, the caring perspective, and not to say that there are lots of men who care too. And having been sort of at the edge of the photovoltaic community, I can tell you that the people who developed and researched photovoltaics for the last 20, 30 years have been knowing full well that they were trying to save the world. This was not done as an interesting scientific research agenda. It was done because they were trying to save the world, and they were quite aware of it. But anyway, the caring perspective is very important to put everywhere. The fact that Greta Thunberg could stand up and say what she says, and she doesn't know a hell of a lot about specific energy issues and solutions, but she said what she thought, and it rang true because it made sense. And that's something we all can do. That's something we all can do. If something doesn't make sense to you, you can stand up and say that. And you can talk in this direction. Okay, voila. I think that's all I have to say. Okay.
All I have to say is, wow. Wow. This is so exciting, really. Okay. No. I was just right here. Thank you so much for all of that. I'm so thrilled. I have a few questions, of course. I have 2 questions that I'd like to throw out to all 3 of you, if that's all right, one by one. The first question is this. I'm getting a little nervous. I'm getting really nervous, actually, because we're talking about the empowerment of women as being the solution, and I believe that deep in my heart. However, I'm pretty old, and I've been working on the empowerment of women for a very long time, and I realize that it's a slow, generational, cultural process. It feels slow to me, the empowerment of women. So my question to you, women, is how can we speed things up? What would be some short-term fixes? And at the end, they tell us we have 12 years left to turn this ship around. How can we empower women in 12 years? So what are some quick fixes within the 12-year span that you might recommend in terms of empowering women? Who goes first?
I'll go first. Hi. So I don't know that I have a good answer to that, but I think we just, as women, we just don't wait for anybody to give us permission. Just whatever it is you need to do it. And anybody encounters roadblocks, but just do it. Don't wait. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I suppose along with what Kara's saying, I think we do see there are no quick fixes. First of all, this is a hugely systemic problem that is not going to be solved within the next 12 years as much as It pains me to say it. But one step that we can make is by using our capital and our, I'm sorry, this was the thing you were going to say later.
No, it's fine.
But by supporting women's businesses and by helping girls to get educated and helping to propel women into positions of power, that's really the only way that we can empower them. And it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of dedication, and it's going to take a lot of outreach, but I do believe that every year things speed up, that this is an accelerating path, and that the work that you guys have done over the past however many years, you know, obviously paved a good road for the people of my generation and, you know, my younger sister's generation to have many more opportunities to realize that vision of women empowered around the world. And you know, I see people like a friend of my boyfriend. She has opened a school in India that's been around for 15 years now and has seen so many young girls go to college that would not have otherwise had the opportunity. And I think by like Kara is saying, you know, just doing what you see needs to be done and helping to support other women who are doing what they think needs to be done, we can make that change faster.
I think as women, we need to get ourselves informed. We need to get ourselves informed. Don't be afraid to read the books and the reports you need to read. Go to conferences, learn. Learn as much as you can, and learn about stuff that you maybe think doesn't look very interesting on the outside, but is crucial for climate change. For example, energy and agricultural issues. And then develop your own opinions about those things based on what makes sense for the good of all human beings. We do this for the good of all humanity, and that is the most empowering idea I can think of.
Okay, that's a good start. I feel better. Thank you. All right, then this is my last question, and then I think we'll open up for questions to everybody. So my wrap-up question for each of you again. All right, ladies, what is your call to action? You know, I'm kind of a doer. I lead these 5,000 women who want to do something. So what would you like us, as the Global Women's Caucus leadership, to do to help this cause? What can I do? What can we do? What can Connie do? What can we do for you?
I would say, so we were talking about this earlier, I would say, one, put your money where your mouth is. So don't spend money on things or things that are offered by people you don't agree with. So, I mean, and I know it's hard, and I know this is a global audience of Americans who need to travel a lot, and it's really hard not to buy plane tickets. But it's not just plane tickets. There are a lot of other things you can choose to buy or not buy, or recycle or not recycle. So that's, I would say, in general, think about where your money's going. Another thing I'll say is to set a good example for others. I sort of inadvertently changed my friends to be vegetarian on accident, just by not eating anything and cooking them dinner all the time. I didn't say anything. I didn't preach about animal rights or the environment. I just cooked them dinner, and slowly, one by one, they all stopped eating meat. Just as an example. So if you can set a good example, environmentally speaking, I think that it speaks louder than words.
She is so smart, whoever said that. I think one of the reasons I was so excited about this panel and coming to this event today was because too often, you know, we find ourselves in these silos in our careers or in the passions that we have and the things that we care about and the causes we volunteer for. And too often, we can become so single-minded about those issues that we neglect to see how they intersect with other issues like women and the environment. You know, how for a long time when I was learning about climate and you know, doing my education and starting out in my career, there was no mention of gender or gender rights or gender equality. It was just about the science, which was great. I learned a lot. But once you take off those rose-colored glasses or put on the intersectionality glasses or whatever you want to, you know, whatever metaphor you want to use, you start to see that the impacts of climate change are so wide-reaching and so it's like a vine that has grown into the earth and affected everything. And I think it's really important that as we move forward, as we, in our days, in our weeks, in our years, we remember that and we try to bring that perspective to all the conversations we have from here on out. How does this affect women? How does this affect the climate? How does this affect the environment? Even if that's not part of the conversation that's happening at that meeting. Sometimes we just have to think outside of the box and look a little differently at whatever we are discussing. And it'll open a whole new world of ideas and creativity.
What's the question again?
How can we
How can we, the Global Women's Caucus, help you in your cause? What do you want me to do? What are my marching orders?
Okay.
Put solar panels on your roof. Get an electric car.
Mhm.
If you live in a building, a multi-propriety build, what do you call it, apartment building, get together with the other apartment people and have jointly put solar panels on the roof to reduce global charges for the building. Insulate your homes. Get a heat pump to heat your homes. Stop emitting carbon. Those things are very important because a lot of people think that to change the world you go out and march. For those of us who can't march physically, there's other things you can do that are very powerful. And then once you do those things, talk to everyone around you in your community. Make sure your state does not have sneaky laws that actually make it very hard to have solar installed. Okay, there's a lot of sort of laws that look as though they're pro-solar, but they're actually anti-solar. Okay, just a few ideas.
Okay, we'll open up for questions from everybody in one moment. But I'd like to say one more thing. One other thing that our Global Women's Caucus is doing in order to keep the momentum going from tonight's event. Next weekend, next Saturday, we're having our first organizational meeting of this new climate team. And we have a little brochure. It's a WebEx conference but you can take one of these little brochures. It shows these are our goals. And one of the important goals that we have as a political group, of course, is to support green candidates. That's our mission for this year, is to support those candidates, identify them and support them, make a lot of noise around them. And I would personally like to know more about policies that are being pushed in Washington. I don't know much about the Green New Deal. I think we could all learn about that, and I want our new group to educate these people about that. Supporting a green lifestyle, raise awareness about all of these things globally, and mobilize voters, because in the end, that's what really makes a difference. So the meeting is online, Saturday, February 1st, at it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, CET. And if you want the WebEx link, just drop me a line, and my address is here. So, okay, then.
Yeah, I wanted to just answer Anne's question, because there is actually not a finality, but a movement towards a political goal with this group and with what's going to happen next week, which is we have a climate platform that we're going to write into the Democrats Abroad platform. And any of you that are interested in helping to write that, please let Anne know, okay? Because what happens is we write a plank. It goes into the platform. It's voted in by the Democrats Abroad Global meeting, which will take place in May in Toronto. And then we take it to the Democratic National Committee, which will then incorporate, if we negotiate well, what we have to say into the overall global platform, which will then be supported by the candidates. So we're not just blah, blah, blahing here. We can get it in writing and really get the feet on the ground and the words on the paper and support the candidates who will vote those laws that we like into state legislation and federal legislation. And with that, I think we're going to stop filming and take questions from the audience. So thank you all for coming, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
And do you want that